nothing about Ireland. Well, I guess I'm going to have to stop wasting so much money on video games. So I think it's fair to say that gaming can be quite an expensive pastime these days. Despite the fact that most new releases are now $70, many modern games also include DLC, season passes, and microtransactions. Not to mention that if you own a console, you will need to pay in order to be able to play online with your friends. This is where free games come in. Games that perhaps aren't the deepest or most complex, but that can offer a decent amount of enjoyment when you don't have any disposable income. I was shocked when I went down the rabbit hole of free horror video games and found some insanely well made and addictive games that somehow are playable free of charge. I would happily pay $5, maybe even $10 for many of the games I'm about to show you, and I highly recommend anyone even vaguely interested in horror games download these titles as soon as possible. There are literally hundreds of free horror games out there, which means that I will probably return to this topic again in future. Estigma is one of those games that is incredibly difficult to describe. On paper, it's an action puzzler where you play as this little worm thing, and your goal is to light every tile red in a stage. Sounds simple enough, but when you actually see the game in motion, it's kinda like... what the fuck? Jesus! Speaking of Jesus, why is Jesus here? It's a total mindfuck of a game that, while very simplistic from a gameplay standpoint, has stayed with me thanks to its trippy and disturbing visuals. Upon starting the game up, you're treated to a very short... You're treated to a very short cutscene featuring some disturbing imagery and text that simply says, "They watched me in my dreams." A brief hint at things to come. The game's first stage is a tutorial designed to teach you everything you need to know in order to play the game. As I mentioned earlier, Estigma is a fast-paced action puzzler where the goal is to light all tiles in a stage red. You light a tile red by simply moving across it. However, moving over a tile a second time will turn that tile dark red, which means you can no longer move across that tile. Thankfully, if you trap yourself, you can quickly restart the stage through the pause menu. Later on, you will also encounter explosive tiles that will detonate upon the player moving across them. The only way to safely bypass these explosive tiles is to first pick up a brain power-up that will allow you to survive a single hit. While all this sounds rather simplistic, what keeps things interesting are the delightfully weird and disturbing creatures you'll meet along your journey, who exist for no other reason than to fuck up your run. From creepy doll heads to whatever the fuck this thing is, there is a surprisingly varied collection of enemies in this game, and they all force you to mix up your tactics. For example, these creatures spit eyeballs at you that will kill you instantly if they make contact, which forces you to keep moving. But on the other end of the spectrum, these Jesus things cannot hurt you, but instead will obscure your view, which makes navigating the map significantly more challenging. You also only have a limited amount of time to complete a stage before the timer runs out and you are forced to replay the entire stage from the beginning. This forces you to think on your feet, adding to the intense nature of the game. Every few stages you'll have to take on a boss of some kind. These encounters are incredibly intense, with the boss usually chasing the player through the stage. There is no room for error in these boss levels. One wrong move and you are dead. These stages can also be quite scary at times, which is not something I expected to say about a game with a 16-bit visual style. I also can't talk about this game and not mention its incredible soundtrack. There aren't a huge amount of tracks in the game, but what is here is incredibly catchy and really adds to the fast-paced nature of the game. I don't think there is much more I can say about Estigma without spoiling some late game content, which is something I'd rather not do, as the fucked up visuals are kind of the main attraction when it comes to a game like this. Also, I would get hella demonetized if I did show content from the late game. While Estigma is a very enjoyable action puzzler for the most part, I wouldn't go in expecting a large amount of content. I finished the entire game in just over half an hour, and I didn't really feel like there was much reason for me to continue playing once I had rolled credits. But if all you are looking for is a quick and fun puzzler to while away a few minutes with, Estigma comes highly recommended. I wasn't expecting much when I first downloaded Mr. Hopps Playhouse. Its gameplay seemed very basic and repetitive, and its visuals looked uninspired. But surprisingly, this might be my favourite game on the list. Mr. Hopps Playhouse is a short but fun 2D survival horror game that is far scarier than it has any right to be. In Mr. Hopps Playhouse, you play as Ruby, a young girl who is terrified of her toy rabbit, the titular Mr. Hop. Ha! He actually looks like my toy rabbit, but at least my rabbit doesn't plan to murder me every night. Isn't that right, Robbie? One night Ruby notices her rabbit seemingly disappear into thin air, so she decides to run to her mom and dad for help. This is where control is handed over to the player. Thankfully though, you are not thrown straight in at the deep end. Instead, you are given a quick tutorial explaining the game's various mechanics. Ruby can run, jump, and crouch to take cover behind objects. She also has a pathetic stamina gauge that only allows her to run for approximately 3 seconds. Once you have gotten the hang of the controls, it's time for Ruby to make her way over to her parents' room. However, upon reaching the room, Ruby discovers that her parents are missing, and so sets out to find them. However, on the way back to her room, Ruby notices something. From here on out, Ruby will need to be careful while exploring her house, so as to not attract the attention of Mr. Hop. The gameplay is admittedly rather simplistic in Mr. Hopps Playhouse. It is essentially a 2D survival horror game, where Ruby needs to sneak around her house, avoiding Mr. Hop whenever possible. Mr. Hop is almost always patrolling around in the background. If Ruby accidentally steps on a toy or makes too much noise, Mr. Hop will quickly come to investigate, and if he manages to catch you, it's lights out. It can actually be surprisingly intense, jumping over toys and quickly moving from cover to cover before the rabbit spots you. Even though the gameplay is incredibly basic, Mr. Hopps Playhouse still manages to frequently mix things up by including the occasional puzzle, or by having Mr. Hop become more aggressive and deranged looking the further you make it through the game. It's legitimately terrifying getting caught by this guy, especially if you suffer from epilepsy.
Battling seizure robots.
The game also has some fucked jump scares, the majority of which I won't spoil here, but the first time I encountered this thing, my soul nearly left its body. Again, just like Estigma, Mr. Hopps Playhouse is not a long game, but you really shouldn't expect that anyways when the experience is free. I completed my first playthrough in roughly 25 minutes, but there are multiple endings to unlock, which will significantly increase the game's replay value. Overall, I loved Mr. Hopps Playhouse. Yes, its gameplay can be simplistic and slightly repetitive, but it's also a legitimately scary experience that managed to startle me more times than I'd like to admit. If you have got a half hour to kill, this is probably my number one pick on this list to download. If you are looking for a free horror game that has a substantial amount of content and replay value, look no further than Empty Shell Prologue, a survival horror roguelike that has hours of content to enjoy if you click with it. The premise of Empty Shell Prologue is simple but intriguing. You play as a volunteer who is sent to a secret facility on a remote Japanese island to investigate what happened to the people stationed there. For some unknown reason, every volunteer is sent to the island one person at a time, and with very few supplies. That is basically all the story you were given at the beginning, but you will be able to find more documents in-game that expand on the lore of this world, and many of these are very interesting and even creepy to read. If you've ever played a roguelike before, then you'll probably already know what to expect from Empty Shell's gameplay. Every new run begins with you stationed just outside the facility. The facility's level design will change every time you die, which means that this free game has potentially limitless replay value. Once inside the facility, you will have to complete a variety of different tasks in order to complete your mission. These usually include simple tasks like flicking a switch in order to restore power to an area, or finding a door code to make more progress through the facility. As mentioned earlier, by exploring the facility thoroughly, you can find documents that fill you in on what happened at the facility, but you can also find different items or weapons that will aid you in your mission. And trust me, you will want to find these additional items, because like most roguelites, Empty Shell can be a punishingly difficult game. Enemies can finish you off in mere seconds if you are not careful. That said, despite its difficult nature, combat is incredibly satisfying in this game. Your guns all feel powerful to use, and blowing away wave after wave of these guys never got old. If you have ever played a twin stick shooter like Hotline Miami, then you'll feel right at home here. Thankfully, you can also play with a controller if you don't wish to use a mouse and keyboard, which is what I ended up doing. Why did I choose to use a controller over keyboard and mouse? Motherfucker, does it look like I can afford a desk? I guess I should also briefly mention the game's very distinctive visual style. Basically, the whole game is played from the perspective of a CCTV surveillance camera. It's definitely an interesting idea, but unfortunately, this visual style can sometimes make it difficult to easily make out enemies or important items in your vicinity, although this issue was rare. Anyways, as someone currently under house arrest, it's nice to finally play a game that adequately conveys what it's like to be under surveillance 24 hours a day. Empty Shell Prologue might well be the best game on this list. It has an interesting premise, fun gameplay, and a shit ton of replay value. Unfortunately though, I've just never really been into the roguelike genre. I find most of them to be infuriatingly difficult and repetitive. That said, if you do enjoy this genre, I could easily see you absolutely adoring Empty Shell. Definitely worth a download either way. Okay, this one might be considered cheating since it's only a demo, but Conscript's demo gives you such a sizable chunk of the overall game that it felt like a worthy inclusion. There is well over an hour worth of content here, which makes it longer than Estigma and Mr. Hopps Playhouse combined. I actually hope the developer puts that on the game's official box art. Conscript is a survival horror game set during World War I, which is a very unique setting for a horror game. To be honest, I didn't think the Great War would be an appropriate setting for a survival horror game, but after completing the demo, I came away impressed by the game's suffocating atmosphere and intense feeling of isolation. In Conscript, you play as a French soldier trying to survive during the Battle of Verdun. At the beginning of the game, the soldier is writing to his family back home and informs them that his brother was injured in battle but has since made a full recovery. However, shortly after he finishes writing his letter, the soldier finds his brother Pierre badly wounded. Despite his injuries, however, it appears Pierre will survive. That is until he suddenly goes missing and things start getting very strange. But I won't spoil any more story elements here. Conscript is a classic survival horror game true and true. We're talking resource management, limited inventory space, and manual saves. It's very obvious that developer Jordan Mochi was heavily inspired by the Resident Evil and Silent Hill series when designing this game, but thankfully he also gives players the freedom to customize the game to suit their playstyle. For example, if you find manual saving too restrictive, you can turn on checkpoints. There are also a wide range of difficulty settings that will cater to practically any skill level. Gameplay wise, you'll know what to expect if you've ever played a classic survival horror game before. You explore a semi-open environment, looking for keys and other items that will allow you to make progress through the game. Resource management is a must, since ammunition and healing supplies can be scarce at times. Combat is intense and anxiety inducing, and every now and then you might have to solve a simplistic puzzle in order to progress. The game is also fucking gorgeous, utilising a stunning pixel art style that is very visually pleasing. World War I has truly never looked this good. I also love the game's use of lighting, especially when you're in a bunker and can barely see 2 feet ahead of yourself, and then you suddenly hear this in the distance. The game can be surprisingly creepy, especially given its simplistic art style. The game also runs like a dream on practically any system, and I didn't have any frame rate issues at any point. Then why is this footage running at 30 FPS? Is what you're probably asking yourself right now. Motherfucker, does it look like I can afford 60 FPS? Unfortunately, one of my few issues with this game so far is that the few puzzles that are here in the demo are incredibly simplistic. For example, at one point you come across a door that is covered in wire. You later come across a pair of wire cutters and use them on the door from earlier. That really is as complicated as things get in the demo, and I really hope the final game has some proper brain teasers. Aside from that, my only other real issue with the game so far is that ammunition is far too plentiful, or at least it was on the normal difficulty. I never felt like I had to conserve my ammunition, and was able to gun down practically every enemy with reckless abandon. Combat is actually very enjoyable, with several different weapons to toy around with. Guns feel meaty, and you really feel the power behind every shot fired. Since the game is set during World War I, the guns you find are fucking old, and as such, are slow and take an absolute age to reload. But I found this really added to the tension, and is actually a great fit for a survival horror game. I just hope in the final game that I feel the need to occasionally conserve my ammunition. Overall, Conscript is looking very, very promising. The story is interesting, the setting works surprisingly well for a survival horror game, the visuals are absolutely stunning, and the gameplay is engaging and very true to survival horror games of old. I can't wait for the final release, and I highly recommend everyone check out the demo. Easily the shortest and most mechanically simplistic game on this list, My Friend is a Raven is still worth downloading for one simple reason. Its absolutely stunning hand-drawn art style. I have played very few games with such an eye-catching art style, and even fewer that were free. In My Friend is a Raven, you play as a man, returning to his apartment in order to speak with a raven, who apparently has the answers to why the world lies in ruin. This game can easily be completed in less than 5 minutes without much effort. However, doing so will net you the game's worst ending. The game has 4 endings, and unlocking them all will require you to solve some pretty clever puzzles. At its heart, My Friend is a Raven is a point-and-click adventure game. You use the A and D keys to move your character either left or right, and you use your mouse or touchpad to highlight objects in the environment you want to interact with. You can pick up certain objects and use those objects with items littered around the environment. It's all very simplistic, and even if you are planning to go for the best ending, you are unlikely to get more than 20 minutes of playtime from this game. But it's still a super interesting and visually gorgeous game, and well worth your time playing. It's also developed by the guy who went on to develop Choo Choo Charles, which is kinda lame.